Most people think discipline is about forcing yourself to do something you don't want to do. They imagine it as willpower, as self-punishment, as restriction. But that's not discipline, that's resistance. Real discipline isn't about saying no to life, it's about saying yes to what matters most. It's about designing your mind to serve your values, not your impulses. If you think about it, every great achievement, whether in business, sports, or personal growth, wasn't born from bursts of motivation. Motivation comes and goes. It was discipline that carried people through when motivation disappeared. The question isn't how do I stay motivated? The question is how do I train my brain to be disciplined when motivation fails? Discipline is not a talent. It's not a gift some are born with. It's a skill, a practice, and most importantly, a mindset. And just like a muscle, your brain can be trained to strengthen it. Today, I want to share with you how discipline is less about controlling yourself and more about shaping the environment of your mind, so that success becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Most people confuse discipline with willpower. They assume that being disciplined means pushing yourself through pain, forcing yourself to work when you don't want to, or constantly saying no to everything that seems enjoyable. But that's not what discipline really is. Discipline is not about punishment or denial. It's about alignment. It's about aligning your actions with your values instead of letting your impulses take control. It's not about being harsh on yourself, but about being intentional with the choices you make every day. Think of it this way: when you wake up in the morning, your brain is already filled with choices. Do I scroll on my phone, or do I get up and start my day? Do I eat what's convenient, or do I choose what fuels me? Each of those moments is a reflection of whether you're living by your values or surrendering to impulses. Discipline is the bridge between what you want now and what you want most. And the difference between the two often decides the course of your life. When people rely only on willpower, they often fail. Why? Because willpower is like a battery. It drains over time. The harder you try to force yourself into doing something you don't want to do, the faster that battery runs out. But discipline doesn't drain you in the same way because it's built on something deeper. It comes from clarity of purpose. When you are clear about why you're doing something, the choice becomes less about resisting temptation and more about honoring your commitment. Consider an athlete training for a championship. If they thought about discipline as willpower, they'd be exhausted every day trying to resist the urge to rest or take shortcuts. But when they align their training with their values, like excellence, growth, or winning for their team, discipline becomes natural. They're not forcing themselves to practice. They're choosing it because it reflects who they are and what they stand for. That's the power of alignment. Discipline also changes the way you experience struggle. When you act out of willpower, every obstacle feels like a fight. It feels like you're constantly battling yourself. But when you live with discipline, obstacles become opportunities. They are proof that you're staying true to your values. And that shift in perspective is what keeps you moving forward, even when things get hard. Think about people who consistently achieve greatness, not just once, but over time. They're not necessarily the most talented, and they're not the luckiest. What sets them apart is discipline. It's their ability to keep showing up, keep doing the work, and keep choosing alignment over impulse. Discipline is not glamorous, and it's not always exciting, but it is the quiet force that sustains success. The truth is, everyone has impulses. Everyone feels tired, distracted, or tempted. The difference is that disciplined people have trained their brains to return to their values, to remember what matters most, and to act from that place. This is why discipline is not about being stronger than others. It's about being clearer. Clearer about who you are, clearer about what you want, and clearer about what choices reflect your purpose. When you look at discipline through this lens, it becomes less about resisting life and more about embracing it. It's about living intentionally rather than accidentally. It's about saying yes to the things that align with your values and letting go of the things that don't. And once you begin to operate this way, discipline stops feeling like a burden and starts feeling like freedom. Motivation is one of those things people often depend on when they want to change their lives. They wait for that rush of energy, that spark of inspiration, that sudden desire to do the hard work. And yes, motivation feels good. It makes us believe we can accomplish anything in that moment. But here's the problem: motivation is temporary. It comes in bursts, and just as quickly as it arrives, it fades. Discipline, on the other hand, is steady. It doesn't rely on emotion or inspiration. It sustains us when motivation disappears, and that is why the people who achieve meaningful success are not those who rely on motivation, but those who master discipline. Think about the last time you set a big goal. At the beginning, you probably felt unstoppable. The excitement was high, and you couldn't wait to get started. That's motivation at work. But fast forward a few days or a few weeks, when the novelty wears off, when the work becomes repetitive, when the results aren't visible yet, that's when most people quit. Not because the goal wasn't worth it, but because they relied on motivation to carry them through, and it wasn't strong enough to last. Discipline, however, doesn't ask how you feel in the moment. Discipline asks, what do I want most? And am I willing to keep showing up for it, even when I don't feel like it? Athletes, entrepreneurs, leaders, every single one of them has faced moments where they didn't feel motivated. The difference is that they didn't wait for motivation to come back. They leaned on discipline. They understood that consistency beats intensity every single time. Motivation might get you to the gym once, but discipline is what keeps you going every day, even when the excitement is gone. Motivation might inspire you to start writing a book, but discipline is what helps you finish it page by page. Discipline is what turns action into habit, and habit into identity. When you train your brain to act regardless of how motivated you feel, you begin to redefine who you are. You're no longer someone who works only when it's convenient. You become someone who follows through because that's simply who you are. And that identity becomes powerful because it means you don't need to rely on external factors to keep you going. You don't need the perfect conditions, the right mood, or even the spark of inspiration. Discipline makes you consistent, and consistency compounds over time. The people who succeed are not always the smartest, the fastest, or the most gifted. Often, they're the ones who show up day after day, doing the work others aren't willing to do. They succeed not because they felt motivated, but because they created disciplined systems that kept them moving forward. They built routines that supported their goals. They surrounded themselves with reminders of what they were working for. They trained their brains to act even when motivation was nowhere to be found. It's important to understand that discipline doesn't mean you'll never feel resistance. You will. There will always be days when you don't feel like doing the thing you promised yourself you would do. But discipline is what overrides that feeling. It doesn't erase the resistance. It simply teaches you to move forward in spite of it. And the more often you practice discipline, the easier it becomes. The brain starts to recognize that the action itself is non-negotiable. It stops being a debate in your head, and it starts being a standard you live by. The reason discipline sustains while motivation fades is because discipline is built on clarity and commitment, not emotion. Emotions change constantly, but values and purpose remain steady. When your actions align with your values, you no longer need the fleeting push of motivation. You have something deeper guiding you. And that deeper drive is what makes the difference between temporary progress and lasting success. The brain is one of the most powerful tools we have, and the way it operates has everything to do with how disciplined we can become. Many people believe discipline is something you either have or you don't, that it's a personality trait or a gift some are born with. But that's not true. Discipline is a mental muscle, and like any muscle, it can be trained, strengthened, and developed over time. The same way you wouldn't expect to lift heavy weights at the gym without practice, you can't expect discipline to suddenly appear at its peak when you've never trained your brain to build it. Every habit you create, every choice you make, rewires your brain in some way. Neuroscience shows us that the brain builds patterns through repetition. The more often you act in a certain way, the stronger those neural connections become. This is why behaviors can feel automatic. They are the product of repeated signals being fired until they become the brain's default response. The good news is that discipline benefits from the same mechanism. By training your brain to consistently choose the harder, but more valuable action, you make that choice easier the next time, and even easier the time after that. Eventually, the action you once struggled with becomes second nature. Consider the person who decides to wake up early every morning. At first, their brain resists. The impulse to hit snooze is strong because the neural pathways tied to comfort and sleep are more developed. But with persistence, the brain starts to adapt. Each time they choose to wake up, they strengthen the connection between waking early and their sense of accomplishment. After weeks or months, the act of rising early no longer feels like a battle. It feels normal. That's not magic. That's brain training at work. This is why discipline should not be seen as punishment, but as practice. Each small disciplined act is a rep for your brain. The same way lifting weights builds muscle fibers, making disciplined choices builds mental resilience. The brain starts to associate effort with progress and discomfort with growth. Over time, your capacity to handle challenges expands because your brain has been conditioned not to run away from difficulty, but to engage with it. Training your brain for discipline also involves awareness. Most of us operate on autopilot more than we realize. We react to impulses without questioning whether they serve us. But when you train your brain, you begin to notice the gap between impulse and action. You create space to pause, reflect, and choose the path aligned with your values instead of the one dictated by immediate gratification. That pause, however small, is where discipline is built. Another key aspect of brain training is reinforcement. The brain is motivated by rewards. Every time you complete a disciplined act, no matter how small, it's important to acknowledge it. That recognition sends a signal to your brain that the behavior is valuable, and it strengthens the likelihood you'll repeat it. Over time, the brain begins to crave the reward of discipline, the sense of pride, progress, and self-respect that comes with following through. This internal reward becomes far more powerful than the temporary comfort of giving in to an impulse. What's remarkable about the brain is its plasticity, its ability to change and adapt throughout life. This means it's never too late to train discipline. Whether you're young or old, the brain responds to repetition and intention. The challenge is not whether your brain is capable of being disciplined. The challenge is whether you are willing to commit to the process of training it, one choice at a time. The more you train your brain in this way, the more resilient it becomes. Instead of being derailed by distractions, you become focused. Instead of giving in to impulses, you gain control. And with each step forward, you prove to yourself that discipline is not a fixed trait, but a skill you've earned through deliberate practice. Discipline is often thought of as something huge, something dramatic, something that requires massive sacrifice. But in reality, discipline is built in the smallest of moments. It's not the grand gestures that create resilience, but the tiny, repeated habits that strengthen your ability to stay consistent. Small habits are powerful because they are easier to implement, easier to repeat, and easier to sustain. Over time, these seemingly insignificant actions compound into something extraordinary. When you look at people who seem highly disciplined, It's not that they're constantly making giant leaps forward. Instead, they've mastered the art of the small step. They've understood that discipline is less about intensity and more about consistency. One push up a day may not transform your body, but it transforms your identity into someone who shows up. Reading 10 minutes a day may not make you an expert overnight, but it builds the muscle of focus and curiosity. These small actions add up, and before long, they create momentum that feels unstoppable. The brain responds to repetition. Every time you repeat a small habit, you reinforce a pathway that tells your brain, "This is who I am." If you choose to write 1 page a day, eventually your brain stops questioning whether you're a writer. It accepts that identity. If you choose to walk after dinner each night, your brain no longer sees it as optional. It becomes your norm. This is how small habits reshape not just what you do, but who you believe yourself to be. Discipline becomes less about forcing yourself and more about acting in alignment with your identity. Another reason small habits are so effective is because they bypass resistance. When you think about massive changes, like writing a whole book, running a marathon, or building a business, the brain often becomes overwhelmed. The task feels too large, and the natural reaction is to procrastinate or give up before even starting. But when the habit is small enough, the brain doesn't resist in the same way. Writing 1 sentence, running for 5 minutes, or making 1 phone call feels manageable. And once you've started, you often find yourself doing more than you intended, because momentum takes over. The hardest part of discipline is getting started, and small habits make starting much easier. These small disciplines also prepare you for bigger challenges. Think of them as training drills. By practicing discipline in the little things, like making your bed, sticking to a morning routine, or limiting distractions, you build the mental resilience required to face larger obstacles. It's the accumulation of these small wins that gives you the confidence and strength to handle situations that require greater discipline. Without realizing it, you're building the capacity to persist through setbacks and maintain focus when others give up. The compound effect of small habits is often underestimated. One choice, one action, might feel insignificant in the moment, but multiplied over time, it creates remarkable change. Missing a workout today doesn't seem like a big deal, but missing consistently weakens your commitment. On the other hand, showing up, even briefly, signals to your brain that your standard hasn't changed. Small habits maintain momentum, and momentum is the secret weapon of discipline. It turns effort into a rhythm and success into a lifestyle. What's beautiful about this approach is that anyone can start. No matter how undisciplined you feel, you can begin with one small habit today. The brain doesn't need you to take massive steps, it just needs you to take consistent ones. And each step makes the next one easier. Over weeks and months, the small becomes significant, the trivial becomes transformational, and the ordinary becomes extraordinary. One of the most overlooked truths about discipline is that it isn't just about personal strength. It's about design. We like to think of discipline as an inner battle, a matter of forcing ourselves to resist temptation through sheer willpower. But the reality is, our environment plays a massive role in shaping our behavior. The spaces we live in, the people we surround ourselves with, and the cues we expose ourselves to either support our discipline or sabotage it. If you want to become disciplined, you don't just train your mind. You design your environment so that the disciplined choice is the easiest choice. Think about how supermarkets are laid out. The snacks and sweets are placed at eye level or near the checkout lines, while healthier foods are often tucked away in less obvious sections. Why? Because environment drives decisions. Marketers know that what you see most often is what you are most likely to choose. The same principle applies to your life. If your phone is next to your bed, you'll scroll before you sleep and the moment you wake up. If junk food is within arm's reach, you'll eat it. If your workspace is cluttered, your focus will be scattered. But if you put systems in place, keeping your phone in another room, stocking your fridge with nutritious foods, or setting up a clean workspace, you're no longer relying on willpower. You're letting your environment do the heavy lifting for you. Discipline becomes much easier when you reduce friction between yourself and the behaviors you want to encourage. If you want to exercise, lay out your clothes the night before. If you want to read more, keep a book on your desk or nightstand. If you want to drink more water, keep a bottle within reach all day. These small adjustments remove unnecessary decisions and make the path to discipline smoother. On the other hand, increasing friction for bad habits also helps. If you want to cut down on distractions, log out of social media or delete apps from your phone. If you want to spend less money, remove your credit card details from online stores. Make the undisciplined choice inconvenient, and you'll naturally drift toward better behavior. The people around you also form part of your environment, and they influence your discipline more than you realize. If you surround yourself with people who constantly complain, procrastinate, or settle for less, it becomes harder to stay disciplined. But if you spend time with people who are driven, consistent, and committed to growth, their energy rubs off on you. Humans are wired for imitation. We pick up habits and attitudes from those closest to us. Choosing the right environment sometimes means choosing the right people, because discipline thrives in communities that reinforce it. Another key element of environment is ritual. When you create a specific space or time for certain behaviors, your brain begins to associate that environment with discipline. For example, if you always write at the same desk with the same setup, sitting in that space will naturally trigger your brain to enter writing mode. If you always meditate in the same quiet corner, that corner becomes a cue for calm and focus. These associations reduce the mental effort required to begin because your environment is priming your brain to act. It's easy to believe that success is purely about inner strength, but the most disciplined people are often those who have mastered outer design. They don't depend on willpower for every choice. Instead, they build systems that support their goals and remove unnecessary temptations. They create an environment where doing the right thing is not a constant struggle, but the natural outcome of their setup. When you understand this principle, discipline stops feeling like a battle you fight every day. Instead, it becomes a natural rhythm supported by the world you've created around you. You no longer ask yourself whether you're strong enough to resist. You simply design your life so that resistance is rarely necessary. By shaping your environment intentionally, you give yourself the greatest gift, the ability to stay consistent not by force, but by design. Many people think of discipline as something restrictive, as if it takes away freedom by limiting what you can do. But the truth is the opposite. Real discipline is what creates freedom. When you control your mind, you gain the ability to choose, to direct your energy, and to live intentionally instead of reactively. Without discipline, you're at the mercy of impulses, distractions, and temporary emotions. With discipline, you take back control of your life and create space for what truly matters. Think about money. Someone without financial discipline spends impulsively, buys things they don't need, and lives paycheck to paycheck. On the surface, it might feel like freedom because they're doing whatever they want with their money. But in reality, they're trapped. Trapped by debt, trapped by stress, and trapped by the lack of long-term security. Someone with financial discipline, however, saves, invests, and spends intentionally. They might say no, more often in the short term, but in the long term, they gain real freedom. The freedom to travel, to retire early, to live without financial stress. That is the paradox of discipline. By limiting yourself today, you expand your possibilities tomorrow. The same is true with health. A person who eats whatever they want, whenever they want, may feel like they're enjoying life without restriction. But eventually, those choices catch up: low energy, poor health, limitations on what they can physically do. On the other hand, someone who practices discipline in their diet and exercise might seem to be sacrificing pleasures, but they're actually buying themselves freedom. Freedom to feel energetic, freedom to move with ease, freedom to live without preventable illness. Discipline creates the conditions for a better, freer future. This principle applies beyond money and health. It applies to every area of life. In relationships, discipline allows you to listen instead of react, to choose kindness over anger, to invest time and energy into building trust. In work, discipline keeps you focused when distractions tempt you, ensuring your projects move forward and your reputation grows stronger. Without discipline, you're not free. You're controlled by your moods, your cravings, and your surroundings. With discipline, you're free to make deliberate choices that align with your values. What makes discipline so powerful is that it transforms from something you do into something you are. At first, it feels like effort, choosing to resist temptation, choosing to focus, choosing to stay consistent. But over time, discipline becomes your identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who struggles with self-control and start seeing yourself as someone who follows through. That identity is freeing because it removes the constant internal debate. You no longer waste energy deciding whether to act. You simply act because that's who you are. The freedom discipline creates is not just external, but internal. It gives you peace of mind. When you live with discipline, you know you're honoring your values. You know you're moving toward what matters most. That sense of alignment removes regret, guilt, and the stress of inconsistency. You don't have to wonder if you're wasting your potential because your actions reflect your goals. That inner freedom is more valuable than any temporary pleasure discipline asks you to delay. Some people see discipline as chains, but those who practice it understand it as keys that unlock the life they want. Freedom without discipline is chaos. Freedom with discipline is choice. And the ultimate power is to know that you're not being pulled in every direction by impulses or circumstances, but instead guided by clarity, purpose, and strength. That is the kind of freedom that lasts, the kind that makes you not just successful, but fulfilled.